Caught my fiancé draining our $10,000 honeymoon fund. He said, I was just gonna borrow it. I left him with nothing but an empty account. My name is Franny. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and up until about a month ago, I was engaged to Caspian. He was the kind of guy everyone said I was lucky to have. Good looking, charming, always cracking jokes at the right time. He had this way of making everyone in the room feel like they were the most important person there. He had that energy. And for a long time, I believed it. I believed him. We'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 2. The wedding was supposed to be in 2 weeks. Everything was planned, the venue, the flowers, the photographer, all of it. We were so close to the finish line. Our honeymoon fund was something I was proud of. I'd been saving up for years, long before I even met Caspian. I worked as a waitress at a local diner, the Winding Fork. It's not glamorous, but I've been there since high school, and I'm good at it. Every tip I could spare went into that account. It was supposed to be for something big, something special. And when Caspian proposed, I knew exactly what it would go toward, our dream honeymoon. 10 days in the Maldives. Overwater bungalows, turquoise water, dinners on the beach. It was something I'd fantasized about for years. Caspian loved the idea, too, or at least, he said he did. We opened a joint savings account just for the trip, and I kept putting money in every week. Caspian didn't contribute much, but I didn't mind. His job at the car dealership wasn't stable, and I figured, as long as we both got to enjoy the trip, what did it matter? It mattered. God, it mattered. 2 weeks before the wedding, I logged into the account to finalize some bookings. The room upgrades, snorkeling excursions, and a couple of splurge-worthy dinners. I wasn't worried. I knew the money was there. I'd checked it just a month ago, and we had just over $10,000 saved. More than enough for the trip. When the page loaded, I froze. The balance wasn't $10,000. It wasn't even close. It was $427.65. I stared at the screen, convinced there had to be a mistake. Maybe I'd logged into the wrong account? Maybe there was a glitch? I refreshed the page, but the number didn't change. My stomach dropped. I clicked into the transaction history. Line after line of withdrawals. Some were at ATMs, others were online transfers. They all added up to one thing, almost $9,500 gone. The dates were recent, too. The money had been drained over the past month. My first thought was fraud. Someone must have hacked the account. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the bank, when something stopped me. There were only 2 people with access to that account, me and Caspian. I felt the room start to spin. It couldn't be him. It didn't make sense. Why would he do that? How could he do that? I stormed into the bedroom. Caspian was still asleep, sprawled across the bed like he didn't have a care in the world. I shook him awake, hard. Caspian. Wake up. He groaned, rolling over to look at me with half-open eyes. What's wrong? He mumbled, clearly annoyed. What's wrong? My voice was shaking. I shoved my phone in his face, showing him the account balance. This is what's wrong. Where is the money? He blinked at the screen, still groggy. Then he sat up, running a hand through his messy hair. Oh, that. He said it like I'd asked him about the weather. Like it wasn't $9,500 that had just vanished from the account I spent years building. What do you mean, oh, that? I snapped. Where is it? I borrowed it, he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. My heart stopped. You what? I borrowed it, he repeated, this time more defensively. I was gonna put it back. I didn't even know what to say. My hands were shaking. My head felt like it was full of static. You borrowed $9,500? For what? Relax, Franny, he said, standing up and stretching like this was just another morning. I had some bills to cover. And I lent a little to a buddy who was in a tight spot. It's not like I spent it on something stupid. You drained our honeymoon fund, I said, my voice cracking. Without telling me. And you think that's not stupid? I was gonna put it back, he said, louder now, like he was the victim here. The wedding's not for 2 weeks. You wouldn't have even noticed. Noticed? I laughed bitterly, the sound coming out sharp and ugly. I'm noticing now, Caspian. Did you think I wouldn't check the account before the trip? He sighed, like I was being unreasonable. I didn't think it'd be a big deal. You're acting like I stole it or something. You did steal it, I shouted. What else would you call this? The conversation spiraled from there. He kept trying to defend himself, saying he didn't see what the big deal was, that he was just borrowing the money, that I was overreacting. Overreacting. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the man I was supposed to marry. The man I trusted with everything. And he thought he could just steal from me, lie to me, and shrug it off like it was nothing. By the time I could form a coherent thought, I'd made up my mind. Get out, I said. Caspian froze. What? You heard me, I said, my voice steady now. Pack your stuff and get out. We're done. Franny, come on, he said, stepping toward me. You're not serious. Do I look like I'm joking? I shot back. You lied to me. You stole from me. I'm not marrying you, Caspian. Now get out. He tried everything. He begged, he yelled, he even tried to blame me, saying I didn't support him enough. None of it worked. I was done. Something inside me had snapped, and there was no coming back from it. Over the next few hours, he packed up his stuff and left. I watched him go, barely able to believe what was happening. This was supposed to be the happiest time of my life. Instead, I was standing in my apartment, alone, staring at the wreckage of what I thought was a future. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Because while Caspian may have walked out the door, he hadn't walked out of my life. Not completely. And I wasn't about to let him get away with what he did. Not without consequences. When Caspian walked out of the apartment that day, I was left with a hollow feeling in my chest. Anger, betrayal, sadness, it all swirled around me in a chaotic mess. But as I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, something else started to bubble up: resolve. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. He thought he could steal my money, my dreams, and walk out without consequences? He had another thing coming. The first thing I did was call the bank. I explained everything: how the withdrawals were unauthorized, how Caspian had taken the money without my consent. They were sympathetic but said there wasn't much they could do since he was a joint account holder. My stomach sank at first, but then the representative said something that lit a spark in me. Have you reported this to the authorities? Since the funds were intended for a specific purpose, you might have a case for fraud. Fraud. The word rang in my ears. I thanked her, hung up, and got to work. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find: bank statements, text messages, everything. Caspian was sloppy, and his lies were easy to prove. The withdrawals lined up perfectly with nights he claimed to be out with the guys or working late. I even found a message to his so-called buddy where he bragged about having a big cash cushion to fall back on. That was enough for me. I filed a police report. While the legal wheels started turning, I focused on cleaning up the mess he left behind. I canceled the wedding, called every vendor, and explained what happened. Most of them were understanding, even refunded me part of the deposits. The venue owner, a kind older man named Mr. Garland, said something that stuck with me: it's better to lose a bit of money now than a lot of peace later. I sold the engagement ring, too. It wasn't anything fancy. Caspian had always been big on appearances but not so much on effort, but it was worth enough to cover the remaining cancellation fees. Every time I thought about him, I funneled that anger into getting my life back together. It felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that he'd tried to take. Then, about 2 weeks after he left, I got a call. The police had tracked down Caspian, and he'd been served with a notice to appear in court. I found out that, legally, I had a strong case. The money was intended for a specific purpose, our honeymoon, and he drained it without my consent. That was fraud, plain and simple. Caspian called me, furious. He demanded to know why I was dragging him through this. I hung up. He texted me, saying he'd pay me back if I dropped everything. I didn't respond. He even showed up at my work once, shouting about how I was ruining his life. My manager kicked him out, and I filed for a restraining order. The court date came quickly. Caspian showed up looking like a scared little boy, his usual cocky charm nowhere to be found. I came prepared, with my stack of evidence and a calm determination to see this through. He tried to spin some sob story about how he just needed help and how I was overreacting, but the judge wasn't buying it. The evidence spoke for itself. In the end, Caspian was ordered to pay back every single penny he'd taken, plus damages. The judge called his actions a clear and deliberate breach of trust. He tried to argue, of course, but it didn't matter. The decision was final. Getting the money back wasn't immediate. It took a few months for the system to process everything, and Caspian didn't make it easy. But little by little, payments started coming in. I used the money to rebuild my savings and even treated myself to a small solo trip to Florida. It wasn't the Maldives, but sitting on the beach with a drink in my hand, I felt free for the first time in years. But the best part? Caspian's life fell apart after the trial. Word spread fast in our small town, and his reputation took a nosedive. He lost his job at the car dealership, and no one wanted to hire him after what he'd done. He ended up moving out of Asheville entirely, tail tucked between his legs. Last I heard, he was living with a cousin in some rundown apartment, working odd jobs to make ends meet. As for me, I've never felt stronger. Losing Caspian was the best thing that ever happened to me. He thought he could steal my money, my dreams, and walk away without consequences. He was wrong. Now, I'm saving up again, but this time, it's for me and me alone. And when I finally take that dream trip, I know it'll be worth the wait. Because revenge isn't just about getting even. Sometimes, it's about finding yourself again, and making sure the people who wronged you never forget it.